Hi, thank you for joining me for another video on Plato's Parmenides. For those of you new to the channel, my name is Mindy Mandell, and what I am presenting in this series is a manuscript that I am working on Plato's Parmenides. If you have not seen the introduction, I do encourage you to watch that video, and I will put a link here for the playlist for this series. In that introductory video, I do talk about my motivations and my influences in writing this book. What I am presenting here is a complete enough draft to present something to you, but it is still open to editing. So as I'm going through this, it would be helpful to me to get some feedback from you. If you find it helpful, I'd really like to know that. Or if there are places where you feel a little more explanation would be helpful to you, a little more discussion to make something clear, it's very helpful to me to know that. So I ask you to please, I would really appreciate if you would put that in the comment section below. Also, you may notice, for those of you returning to this series, you may notice that there is new cover art. One of the viewers of this channel is a professional graphic designer named Gabriel Soto, and he was inspired to make this new cover, and so I do want to thank him for that. And I will put his contact information, you can see it on the screen, if anyone is looking for a graphic designer. Also, I will put a link in the description box for his webpage, so you can check out some of his work. It's really very impressive. So thank you, Gabriel. Before I go to the text, I will point out that what you're going to see here is the first half of the chapter on the second hypothesis. This is the longest chapter in the book. It goes on for some 45 pages. And that's because I use Proclus's scheme to go through the second hypothesis, each of the metaphysical levels that he recognizes throughout this, through Parmenides' second hypothesis, the entire structure of the hierarchy of metaphysical levels. And so I'm going to run through all of that. It's quite lengthy, but I felt that it's meaningful to see the whole thing laid out. Most of it is from his theology of Plato, but I pulled out what is necessary, what is directly relevant to the Parmenides. And so I think it's very helpful, to see it in a condensed form like this. However, there is this sort of there's this difficulty of, on the one hand, I do want to be thorough, but on the other hand, it's part of a bigger picture. This book is looking at the dialogue as a whole. It's not focusing just on the second hypothesis. The second hypothesis fits into a bigger whole, and that is my focus. And so it is a bit dense, that there's a lot packed into these 45 pages. So if there are places where you felt that more explanation was necessary, it's really helpful to me to know that. That said, I'll jump into the text now. We're going to see from the beginning here, it starts with a quick overview of the way Proclus designs the metaphysical hierarchy, because that is the structure that I'll be looking at for the rest of this chapter once I get into the Parmenides. So there's a quick overview of that, and then I jump into his hierarchy, and we're going to see what he calls the intelligible realm, and then what he calls the intelligible and at the same time intellectual realm. Okay, and that will be explained in the text. All of the quotes that you see in this chapter are from Thomas Taylor unless otherwise stated. And in addition to quoting extensively from Plato's Parmenides, there are also many quotes from Proclus's theology of Plato, and those are cited with the letters PT, for Platonic theology. So that is what that citation means. I wanted to point that out. Also, I do want to point out that in his translation of the Parmenides, he calls the interlocutor of Parmenides Aristotle. This Aristotle is not the Aristotle who's now famous to us. This is a young boy who was present on the day that Parmenides was having this conversation. Was there anything else I wanted to say? I think that's everything. So I will jump into the text now, and I'm going to be reading this without any additional commentary because, again, I do want to know if what I presented is sufficient for your understanding. Okay, let's get into the second hypothesis. And as you may recall from the chapter on structure, the dialectical question we are looking at here is, if one is, what results for the one in relation to itself? The bulk of discussions around Parmenides is understandably centered around the first hypothesis. The one self beyond all existence, the first principle and condition for all that is the highlight of the Platonic tradition. Yet, as significant as the first hypothesis is, the second hypothesis just might be the heart of this dialogue. It is here that Plato lays out his vision of reality and its unfolding into realms. The second hypothesis demonstrates the one self of the first hypothesis overflowing into being, manifesting what we might call the one that is, or the self that is. Plato calls the experience of this beauty in Symposium, and in Republic, he refers to it as the idea of the good. Here in Parmenides, he calls this one being and clarifies that this is the self that is, for to know this is to know thyself. The further this overflow unfolds, the more differentiated it becomes. It therefore becomes harder to recognize the one as it proliferates into manyness. Yet, throughout this description of real beings, the mark of the one can be discerned. The structure of the second hypothesis is closely tied to that of the first. Namely, the discussion is again concerning the intelligible gods in the second hypothesis. For the things which are denied in the first are affirmed in the second hypothesis. Therefore, it would be worthwhile to recall all of the points that were denied in the first. Here is a list of those points in the order in which they appeared. So we have many, whole and part, beginning, middle, and end, limited, figure or shape, in itself, in another, in motion, at rest, same, different, similar, dissimilar, equal, unequal, same age, different age, younger, older, same age, in time, being, one. Fortunately for us, we do not have to piece together from scratch Plato's framework of reality here in the second hypothesis. Proclus did a great deal of the work for us and presented it in his Theology of Plato. Proclus offers perhaps the most comprehensive discussion of how to tie the affirmation of these terms to the various realms of reality. There are necessarily as many orders of the gods as the Parmenides of Plato unfolds to us in the second hypothesis. This structure, then, will provide the organization for my presentation of the second hypothesis. I want to note up front, though, that Proclus's schema is not dogma to be memorized. Rather, it is a possible approach to be contemplated. It offers us a way of organizing in our minds the various realms of reality and the orders of wholes associated with each of these realms. I hope also to stress the unity and oneness that flows through all that is real. These orders of wholes can also be understood as orders of the gods. Through the contemplation of this vision, we can start to bring into focus the rich texture of the unfolding of reality. Before turning to the text of Plato's Parmenides, I will briefly lay out some key elements of the metaphysical hierarchy that unfolds throughout the second hypothesis. In our efforts to make sense of this hierarchy, we try to diagram the realms as if there were a linear flow from the most unified to the most differentiated. This, of course, does not capture the full profundity of all that is, but it does give us a helpful framework from which to proceed. And so we see a diagram here of the one self separated off from the realms of reality, and then you see the intelligible, intelligible and intellectual, intellectual, soul, nature, and materiality. The basic linear flow in Proclus's schema puts the intelligible world as the highest realm of reality, sometimes called reality itself. This is followed by what Proclus calls the intelligible and intellectual realm. This realm is the highest of the intellectual worlds, while also being tied to the intelligible realm. It is here that reality as a unity manifests into experience. This then is followed by the intellectual realm, which is then followed by the realm of soul. The realm of soul is intellectual in nature, but introduces self-motion. The next realm, that of nature, is a reflection of the intelligible intellectual realm. At this level, motion is extended into the realm of time and space, which is the final realm. Time and space are the marks of the realm of materiality, which is a reflection of intelligible reality. Whereas intelligible reality is eternal and unchanging, the realm of materiality is in perpetual flux. Rather than eternally being, it is in a perpetual state of becoming, coming into and going out of existence. The one itself, or the one self, is of course the transcendent principle beyond all of these realms. Each realm can be understood triadically, and there are a number of ways to discuss this dynamic. The schema we choose largely depends on the focus of a given discussion. Perhaps the most common way to discuss the triad is as consisting of three aspects: being, life, and intellect. Being refers to what the realm most fully is. Its life is its power. Anything that is must exert some power. Its intellect is its intellectual activity, its function as what it most fully is. Another set of terms we can add here is abide, proceed, and revert. This set of terms actually complements the first set. Being, as what the realm is, constitutes the realm as completely abiding in itself. It is the realm in its most unified aspect. Life, as its power, is its movement. It is the realm as proceeding outward, extending its power outward toward activity. This brings us to the third aspect of the triad, its intellectual activity. This activity is the intellectual act of reverting to the summit of the realm, thereby knowing itself. This is the fullest flowering of the realm, the realm most fully what it truly is. This activity of reversion brings the three moments of the triad together into a ceaseless unity that collectively is the essence of that realm. This collective activity is often referred to in Greek as ousia, and ousia is often translated as essence. I should note that essence is often labeled as the summit or hyparxis of the triad instead of its extremity. In this case, it is denoting the result of the recursive activity. This is particularly common when using the terminology of the Chaldean oracles. In this schema, rather than describing this triad with the terms being, life, and intellect, we instead use the terms essence, power, and activity. Whichever terminology is used, this basic analogous relationship flows from one realm to the next. Further, each of these three moments in the triad can, in turn, be understood triadically. Each has its own being, power, and activity. Therefore, each realm can be discussed as a triad of triads. While there are far more nuances that I could have made, this gives us a nice blueprint from which to see how Parmenides unfolds each of the realms triadically. This summary, brief though it is, gives us a framework in which to recognize the metaphysics revealed in the second hypothesis of Plato's Parmenides. Okay, so the first intelligible triad is called unity. The first hypothesis ends with Aristotle agreeing that if the negations of the one are accurate, then the one self must be as Parmenides deduced. However, he ultimately rejects that result, saying those conclusions about the one were impossible. He, it seems, only accepts that the one either is or is not. He cannot grasp that the one could transcend that dichotomy. It is from here, then, that Parmenides picks up his discussion. He makes it clear, though, that his discussion will follow the same logos, the same reasoning as he used to conclude about the self. Have we not therefore declared if the one is, what circumstances ought to happen to it? This ties the previous discussion about what we are calling the first hypothesis to the discussion that follows. However, the ties to the self are even clearer when we recognize that the word logos is in the Greek and that it, in the sentence above, is the Greek auto. I will turn to a more literal translation of this line by the translator Juan Balboa. Is it not the case, then, that if we say one is, then we must go through the same logos about these following conclusions about the self, whatever they happen to be? Or is it not so? Indeed, it is the logos that is manifesting through these hypotheses, illustrating for us the flow from the ineffable principle about which we can affirm nothing. The logos that wound us through the first hypothesis will now carry us along the unfolding of wholes as it reveals all the realms of reality. The peak of the second hypothesis is what is often referred to as the one that is. In order to discuss the one that is, Parmenides looks to the intelligible world. As we saw in the summary of metaphysics just above, we can understand this intelligible world as a triad of triads. When the intelligible world is discussed in this way, the highest intelligible triad is the unity of the intelligible gods, known in metaphysics as the Henads. Henad is actually a transliteration of a Greek word that means oneness. The intelligible gods, then, are collectively a oneness or unity. Following his discussion of the one self of the first hypothesis, Proclus tells us, after this imparticipable, ineffable, and truly superessential cause, which is separated from all essence, power, and energy, the discussion of the gods immediately follows. For to what other thing prior to the unities is it lawful to be conjoined with the one? Or what else can be more united to the unical God than the multitude of gods? Proclus refers to this multitude of gods as a multitude characterized by unity. This unity is demonstrated by Plato in his Parmenides by opening the second hypothesis with this line. But consider from the beginning, if the one is, can it be possible that it should be and yet not participate of essence? Whereas we denied essence of the one in the first hypothesis, here we are considering the one and essence together. Right off the bat, then, we are starting not from one, but from two. Will not essence, therefore, be the essence of the one, but not the same with the one? For if it were the same, it would not be the essence of the one, nor would the one participate of essence. But it would be all one to say the one is and one. The two terms we are looking at are essence and the one. These two are not the same. They are not interchangeable. They can, however, come together in the union described here. The statement, the one is, implies a union in which the one exists and essence is one. In Platonic metaphysics, this union is called one being. There is another point of significance here worth mentioning. Notice that in the quote above, introducing the second hypothesis, Parmenides says that it is the one that participates essence, or ousia, not the other way around. We tend to imagine that the lower participates the higher. Things in our physical realm, for example, are said to participate the eidos. Small things are small because they participate smallness itself. To the degree justice manifests in this world, it is by way of participation in justice itself, and so on. Yet here, we are given the image of the one reaching down to unfold itself. As this unfolding proceeds into the proliferation of number, we will see the one participating in the very activity that it unfolds. In metaphysics, we call this activity ousia, or essence, and recognize this activity as intellectual in nature. In the second hypothesis, then, we are seeing how the one that is functions. Another way of looking at this is to see that while ousia is essence or being, the one is not being in the sense of transcending being. Of course, it is only in contrast to being that we can call the one not being, because such a label does not make sense in describing the one of the first hypothesis. The one of the first hypothesis is beyond all labels and all descriptions. It is not relative to anything else. We can say nothing at all of the first hypothesis 1. And yet, when the second hypothesis 1 comes together with ousia as the one being, they are two sides of the same coin. They are inseparable. The one flows through all the realms of reality by never separating from being. Turning to Proclus, he sees this hypothesis opening with the highest genus of the intelligible gods. This is the first intelligible triad. These gods are the first unfolding from the one, and so most like to their cause. As such, they are a unity. Proclus explains, the cause of all things being unically raised above all motion and division, has established about itself a divine number, and has united it to its own simplicity. The one, therefore, prior to beings, has given subsistence to the unities of beings. These gods transcend all that exists, functioning as cause to the series they head, namely being. In this way, they hold a place among beings that is analogous to the place held by the first hypothesis 1 to all the orders of the gods. Hence, also, it is allotted the same transcendency with respect to all the intelligible orders, as the one with respect to every genus of the gods. For this intelligible, namely the one being, is imparticipable and supernally fills the divine and intellectual orders. We can state this analogy most clearly as the one is to every genus of the gods as the one being is to the intelligible orders. Indeed, there is a pattern throughout Proclus's schema that places a principle transcendently over each series. The gods of the first intelligible triad are collectively unity, and they are tied to the principle being. Intelligible being transcends all that is as the exempt cause of that series. Analogous relationships will unfold in the pages that follow as we discuss the second intelligible triad and the third. All three intelligible triads are the heads of their proper series, and as such, they are transcendent in relation to their series. In regards to the first intelligible triad, Proclus clarifies that this unity can be understood triadically, with power in the middle. This power is what connects the one to essence, referred to as both essence and being in the following quote, and essence to the one. The first triad, therefore, is called one being, since power is here occultly. For the triad does not proceed from itself, but subsists without separation and uniformly, being primarily defined according to divine union. Hence, this is the first participation of essence, which participates of the one through power as the middle, which collects together and separates both the one and being. And it is superessential indeed, but is conjoined with essence. At the peak, then, of the second hypothesis, we have a divine unity that is not a pure one, but which is most alike to its pure principle. This unity can be understood triadically as the one, being, and the power that holds them together. Yet these three are indelibly united into a monad. We call this monad one being, or the one that is. This one that is the transcendent head of the series of beings. As such, It is prior to all beings as the imparticipable cause of all that is. Most spiritual systems culminate here, at the pinnacle and principle of being. This is pure, unified being, the principle from which all that is unfolds. Some find it hard to imagine anything beyond this, for how can anything be beyond being? Yet we saw in the first hypothesis that Plato recognized a principle and source beyond even the apex of being. Anything that exists must have a cause. It follows that even pure being must have a cause. This distinction between Platonism and most other spiritual systems will be addressed in the final chapter of this book. And so now I'll go on to the second intelligible triad, which Proclus calls wholeness. To highlight that the one being abides in itself and transcends all the subsequent intelligible orders, Parmenides restates the second hypothesis in order to progress to the second intelligible triad. Again, therefore, let us say, if the one is, what will happen? In this way, he separates the one being from the divine orders that follow. He is ready now to move from unity to wholeness. Here, difference has entered into the unfolding of reality. As a result, procession away from pure unity has begun. However, this triad is still not yet differentiated into manyness. Hence the name whole. What we are looking at here is a whole of parts that are not yet separated one from another. Consider then whether it is not necessary that this hypothesis should signify such a one as possesses parts. To be clear, Parmenides is still in the unified world of the intelligible. What he is referring to here is the second triad in that divine realm. Power is more divided in the second triad, introducing separation. The one and being are no longer united as they were in the triad above. Rather, they are parts of the whole. If the term it is spoken of one being, and the one of being which is one, and essence is not the same with the one, but each belongs to that same one being which we have supposed, is it not necessary that the whole of it should be one being, but that its parts should be the one and to be? Proclus explains it in this way. Above, indeed, i.e., in the first triad, all things are prior to parts and wholeness. But in this triad, there are both parts and a whole, power unfolding itself into light. For as there is separation here, there are parts and the whole consisting of these. The second triad, therefore, is called intelligible wholeness. But the parts of it, the one and being, I call the extremes. And power, being here the middle, connects the one and being, and does not cause them to be one in the same manner as in the first triad. Since also it is the middle of both, through its communion indeed with being, it renders the one being. But through its communion with the one, it perfectly causes being to be one. And thus the one being consists of two parts, namely, of being which is characterized by the one, and of the one which is characterized by being, as Parmenides himself says. This second intelligible triad, then, is the divine whole. Through these things, therefore, Parmenides defines the second order of intelligibles to be a wholeness. For as existence is derived to all things from the first triad, so whole from the second, and an all-perfect division from the third. We can talk about this whole and its parts in yet another way, perhaps even more profound, by bringing in a recognition of the use of self in Parmenides' quote. Looking at the Greek at 142d, this statement could also be translated as follows. If the term it is spoken of one being, and the one of being which is one, and essence, is not the same with the one, but each belongs to that self which we have supposed, such as the one being. Is it not necessary that the one being necessarily be the whole self, but that its parts should be the one and to be? I do want to point out the footnote here. It reads, "For this translation, I aim to stay as close as possible to Taylor's, while also including self as a translation of auto. To help me to do this most accurately, I referred to the translation by Juan and Maria Balboa." And that translation, of course, will be in the bibliography at the end of the book. Comparing Thomas Taylor's translation to this one, you can see that the only change I made was to keep the word self, where he chose to translate auto as either same, or he used it as a reference to one being. This language of the self has largely been overlooked, and in some instances, even shunned. I suspect this is because of the mystical implications it carries. In the case of a mystic such as Thomas Taylor, the oversight is more likely one of convention. Using self in the above quote is admittedly an odd way of talking. However, auto is clearly in the Greek text. Bringing it into English allows us to connect one being to our quest to know thyself. One being is not just some abstract philosophical term. It is the self that is. Seeing this awakens an appreciation that one being points us towards what we truly are. Now, seeing this connection to ourselves, we can contemplate the significance of our connection to the whole of one participating ousia. At this early stage, we are seeing reality, and indeed the very essence of which we are connected, beginning to unfold. The one being has progressed from unity into that which can divide. The division is not yet complete, however. Rather, we can talk of parts and a whole. It is a whole in which distinction has not yet entered. We saw that the one being of the first triad is the cause of being, and so is prior to it. In an analogous way, we see here that the second triad is the cause of difference, and so is prior to distinction. It is a whole that is not yet many. This is the transcendent cause that allows manyness to emerge in the third triad. And so this brings us to the third intelligible triad, infinite multitude. The third intelligible triad is also known in our metaphysics as intelligible intellect. Intelligible intellect is the home of the intelligible forms or ideas. These forms are the paradigm of our physical world. This triad, although still intelligible, introduces differentiation to the unfolding of reality. As a result, whole has proceeded into an infinite multitude. And of this third triad, Plato's Parmenides unfolds it in these next statements. Can each of these parts of one being, the one and being, desert each other so that the one shall not be part of being, or being shall not be part of the one? It cannot. Again, therefore, each of the parts will contain both one and being, and each part will at least be composed from two parts. And on the same account, whatever part takes place will always possess these two parts. For the one will always contain being, and being the one. So that two things will always be produced, and no part will ever be one. This gives us an image of, for example, a yin-yang symbol with the two parts consisting of one in being. However, there would have to be an infinite number of symbols within the symbols. Each one is a pairing of one in being, as is each being. These parts, in turn, are also pairings of one and being. And there you see a diagram of that. Will not, therefore, one being thus become an infinite multitude? This multitude, however, is not a multitude in the sense of quantity. We are still talking about the intelligible world here, and so we are looking at a wholeness. It is a wholeness, however, that proceeds from the intelligible whole of the second triad. This prior whole, remember, expands out of unity by the emergence of the power of difference. It is therefore this power which marks the proliferation of parts, ones and beings, within the whole. On this point, Proclus explains, this triad, therefore, proceeds according to both the pre-existent triads and proceeding to all intelligible multitude. For infinite multitude is indicative of this flux and of the incomprehensible nature of power. This order proceeds to a greater extent, unfolds the occult nature of the triads prior to itself, and is primogenial, unfolding in itself prolific power. The last part of the above quote from Proclus is worth stressing. The ones and beings multiplied within this whole comprise an infinite multitude in the sense of power, not of quantity. The second triad is marked by power and is in this regard the first infinity. It is here then in the third triad of the intelligible world that this infinite power shines forth. Before I go to that quote, I do want to point out the footnote at the bottom of the page. And this is a reference to the second triad being called the first infinity. See, for example, Proclus's Elements of Theology, Proposition 92. Every multitude of infinite powers is suspended from one first infinity, which does not subsist as a participated power, nor in things which are endued with power, but subsists by itself, not being the power of a certain participant, but the cause of all beings. For though the first being possesses power, yet it is not power itself, for it has also bound. But the first power is infinity, for infinite powers are infinite through the participation of infinity. And going back to the text, we have here a quote pointing to this last sentence just above it. It is here then in the third triad of the intelligible world that this infinite power shines forth. If indeed that which is primarily infinite was infinite according to quantity, it would be requisite to admit that the intelligible is infinite multitude of this kind. Since, however, the intelligible is infinite power, it is necessary that the participant of the primarily infinite should cause infinity to shine forth according to the power which is comprehensive of all prior natures. Proclus denotes this infinite multitude as the third intelligible triad. It is the transcendent cause of infinite intellectual power. We will see later in this chapter that this third term of the intelligible world is the divine monad of the intellectual world. This notion of an infinite multitude will be opened up more fully later in the analysis when Parmenides extends down to the intellectual world. And now we move on to the intelligible and at the same time intellectual world. Parmenides moves from the three triads of the intelligible world into those of the second world, which, in conformity to Proclus's terminology, I am calling the intelligible-intellectual world. To help us understand the relationship between these two divine worlds, I will turn to Proclus. He explains that the three triads of the intelligible-intellectual world are analogous to the three triads in the world above. There were three intelligible triads, therefore, namely the one being, whole, and infinite multitude, and three intelligible and at the same time intellectual triads have also presented themselves to our view, namely number, whole, and the perfect. Hence, from the one being, number is derived. From the intelligible whole, the whole that is in these, and from infinite multitude, the perfect. So you can see there a diagram showing those three analogies. Please let me know in the comments section if you find this confusing. This is a vivific world analogous to intelligible life, the second intelligible monad. It is marked by power, much as the intelligible world is marked by unified being at its hyparxis. The monad of this world, then, is the center of this triad. This wholeness is the connective God that holds this world in a unity. In Phaedrus, Plato calls this God heaven. The footnote directs you to 247b. Mythologically, this is Uranos, the grandfather of Zeus and the father of Kronos. Uranos is the intelligible God we meet when we are initiated into the mysteries of the divine banquet of the gods in what Plato in the dialogue Phaedrus calls the supercelestial place. This mystical experience mythologized in Phaedrus is also described in Symposium, where it is called beauty, and in Republic, where it is described as seeing the sun himself by himself in his own proper region. This is the intelligible whole manifested into light through the power of intellectual differentiation, or number. As such, this is a significant shift in the unfolding of reality away from the unity of the intelligible world. To make his transition to the intelligible intellectual world, Plato's Parmenides makes a third start to his second hypothesis. This is hard to see in Thomas Taylor's translation. But proceed and still further consider this. I will briefly turn to a few other translations. Francis Cornford offers us this rendition. We must also proceed in another way, as follows. Harold North Fowler perhaps captures the new beginning most clearly. Let us make another fresh start. Why does Parmenides need a third beginning? I would argue that it is to denote that the intelligible world transcends all of the realms that flow from it. The first start marked the beginning of his discussion of the second hypothesis. This separated the first hypothesis oneself from all the realms of reality. The second start cuts intelligible being off from the rest of the intelligible triad. Intelligible being is both the being of the intelligible world and, as the unity of the gods, it is the transcendent monad of this world. A third start is warranted when we recognize that each of the intelligible triads serves as a monad of its corresponding world. The first triad is the monad of the intelligible world. The second triad as the monad of the intelligible-intellectual world. And the third triad as the monad of the intellectual world. To transition now to the intelligible-intellectual world, Parmenides brings in difference. Much as the three triads of the intelligible realm were marked by the one being, this realm reveals itself to be marked by difference. The intelligible whole in the world above introduced difference, but as a transcendent cause. It is here, in the intelligible-intellectual world, that difference comes clearly into view. Parmenides introduces difference in this way. If, therefore, essence is one thing, and the one another thing, neither is the one, so far as the one, different from essence, nor essence, so far as essence, different from the one. But they are different from each other through that which is different and another. What he is saying here is a bit confusing. We have not yet progressed to realms in which things are different by comparison. In our physical world, this is so. We can enumerate the differences between a baseball and a tennis ball, or between a duck and a swan. We bring a distinct mode of thought, though, to our contemplations of the intelligible intellectual world. There, the one and essence are different simply by difference. Difference, as mentioned above, first emerges in the intelligible world, exerting its own energy in the intelligible whole, but it fully shows itself here. In the intelligible and at the same time intellectual triad, difference presenting itself to the view, which is the image of the concealed and ineffable power in the first triad of intelligibles, and luminously exerting its own energy, separates the one from being, and being from the one, leads each into divided multitude, and thus generates total number. Proclus is describing here the flow of difference through each of the intelligible triads, showing how it results in the generation of number. In the first intelligible triad, difference is concealed and ineffable. It exerts its own energy in the second triad, thereby separating the one from being. This results in the expansion from unity to whole. Then, in the third intelligible triad, it is difference that carries the procession from whole into the power of proliferation, thus giving us infinite multitude. We now have an infinite power shining forth, but it is in the intelligible intellectual world that we are introduced to number. And so this brings us to the first intelligible intellectual triad, number. At this point in the second hypothesis, Parmenides singles out the one of the one being. We have said that the one participates of ousia so far as it is being. We have said so, and on this account, one being appears to be many. It does so. But what then? If we receive dianetically that one which we said participates of essence, or ousia, and apprehend it alone by itself, without that which we have said it participates, will it appear to be one alone, or will this also be many? I think it will be one. We saw above that the intelligible whole is the self, and it was presented there as being composed of two parts, namely the one and ousia, or essence. Now Parmenides is separating these two parts, and we will see that he is doing this in order to generate number. Before looking at the formation of number, though, I do want to open up the above quote more fully. This will allow us to see more clearly that it is indeed the self that is unfolding into differentiation through number. To aid in this endeavor, I will plug self in wherever auto is used in the Greek. Doing this, Parmenides' final statement above would read in this way. Before looking at that, I do want to again bring you to that final statement as it's translated by Thomas Taylor. But what then, if we receive dianoetically that one which we said participates of essence, and apprehend it alone by itself, without that which we have said it participates, will it appear to be one alone, or will this also be many? Now, plugging in self, it reads like this. But what then, if we receive dianoetically that one self, autotoen, which we said participates of essence, and apprehend it self according to self, without that which we have said it participates, will it appear to be one alone, or will this also be many? Here we see clearly that the whole that is made up of the one and ousia is indeed the one self. Parmenides will now show us that the self unfolds into activity, and it functions through coupled pairs. To introduce number, Parmenides sets up three sets of dyads. What then, if we should select from them, whether, if you will, essence indifferent, or essence in the one, or the one indifferent? Should we not, in each assumption, select certain things which might very properly be denominated both these? And so there you see the three coupled pairs as described in that quote. Using this, Parmenides is going to give us the first triad of the intelligible intellectual world. His way of setting this up is admittedly confusing. He starts by laying out a bunch of numbers for us. Let's group all the numbers together and then see what the value is in doing this. Bear with me while I give you a bunch of seemingly odd and meaningless quotes. And can any reason be assigned why of two things each of them should not be one? But if each of them is one, and the one is placed together with them by any kind of conjunction, will not all of them become three? With these quotes, we now have the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Being two, is it not necessary that twice should be present? In being three, thrice? Since twice one subsists in two, and thrice one in three. But if there are two and twice, is it not necessary that there should be twice two? And if there are three and thrice, then there should be thrice three. Well, twice two is 4, thrice 3 is 9. We are almost done. One more set of combinations. But what if there are 3 and twice and 2 and thrice? Is it not necessary that there should be thrice 2 and twice 3? Whether we multiply 2 times 3 or 3 times 2, we get 6. Pulling all of these numbers together, we now have this set. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 9. If, therefore, this be the case, do you think that any number will be left which are not necessarily there? What does it mean to say that this set, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, comprises the necessary numbers, or numbers which are necessarily there? Well, here is one possible explanation. If you were to fiddle with these numbers, you would find that these numbers are the only ones you would need to show the 3 kinds of mean analogies that Plato presents in the Timaeus as the analogies necessary for the unfolding of the physical universe. Here is a passage from that dialogue. Since it is necessary that a corporeal nature should be visible and tangible, and since nothing can be visible without fire, and nothing tangible without something solid, and nothing solid without earth, hence the divinity, beginning to fabricate, composed the body of the universe from fire and earth. But it is impossible for 2 things alone to cohere together without the intervention of a third, for a certain collective bond is necessary in the middle of the 2. And that is the most beautiful of bonds, which renders both itself and the natures which are bound remarkably one. But the most beautiful analogy naturally produces this effect. For when either in 3 numbers or masses or powers, as is the middle to the last, so is the first to the middle, and again, as is the last to the middle, so is the middle to the first. Then the middle becoming both first and the last and the first passing each of them into a middle position, they become all of them necessarily the same as to relation to each other. But being made the same with each other, all are one. It is through these analogies, then, that the universe is unfolded. Namely, the analogies are the arithmetic, geometric, and harmonic analogies. Each of them can be used as mean analogies, or an analogy with 3 terms. And so I write the 3-term analogy in this way. A is to B as B is to C. The arithmetic mean is what we generally think of when we consider the mean between 2 numbers. It represents an equal distance between A and C. For example, 2:3 is 3:4. The geometric mean, on the other hand, calculates the term that is an equal factor between A and C. For example, 1:3 is 3:9 is a geometric mean analogy. The relationship between 1 and 3 and between 3 and 9 is by a factor of 3, because 1 times 3 is 3 and 3 times 3 is 9. The third type of mean to consider is the harmonic mean. In his Theoretic Arithmetic of the Pythagoreans, Thomas Taylor defines the harmonic mean as the greatest term is to the least, so is the difference of the greatest in the middle and the difference of the middle and the least term. This definition requires some unpacking. An example will make this clear. So I used as my example 2:3 is 3:6. And again, that matches to the basic formula, A is to B is B is to C. So the greatest to least term would be C to A, or in this example, 6:2. The difference of the greatest and middle terms would be C minus B, or in the case of this example, 6 minus 3, which equals 3. The difference of the middle and least terms, B minus A. In this example, 3 minus 2, which equals 1. So as the greatest term, 6, is to the least term, 2, so is the difference of 6 and 3 to the difference of 3 and 2. So the difference of 6 and 3 is 3, the difference of 3 and 2 is 1. So therefore, the harmonic mean would be written in this way. 6 is to 2 as 3 is to 1. What is special about this proportion? Notice that in this example, the middle term, 3, surpasses the least term, 2, by 1, which is half of 2. The greatest term, 6, surpasses the middle term, 3, by 3, which is half of 6. In other words, the middle term is related to both of the extremes by the same ratio. Aside from this symmetry feeling satisfying, this harmonic proportion is cited in Timaeus as the building block of the soul. Consider, for example, this passage from Timaeus. After, therefore, the whole composition of the soul was completed according to the intention of its artificer, in the next place he fabricated within soul the whole of a corporeal nature, and conciliating middle with middle, he aptly harmonized them together. Now, notice what happens when I gather together all of the numbers used to demonstrate these three fundamental analogies. For the arithmetic analogy, I used 2, 3, 4. For the geometric analogy, I used 1, 3, 9. And for the harmonic analogy, I used 2, 3, 6. Putting all of these numbers together gives me the set 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 9. What we find here is that we used all of the numbers in the set introduced in Parmenides, and we don't need any others. These are the numbers necessary for the unfolding of the physical universe. These numbers are useful then by way of analogies. The word analogy comes from Greek roots and literally means another logos. It is by way of the logos, through these intelligible patterns that we call analogies, that the one unfolds into manyness. To clarify that Parmenides is progressing into differentiation via analogy through number, Parmenides then goes on to talk about the progression of the one into manyness. If, therefore, the one is, it is also necessary that there should be number. What does this mean? Parmenides is stating that there is a necessity for the one to unfold. It will not simply remain one. In Greek mythology, goddesses represent, among other things, generation. For this reason, female deities were assigned to the intelligible-intellectual world. Proclus writes, "From these first principles, the three intelligible triads, number together with difference proceed, and they generate the monads and the duads which are in number, and all numbers. For both the generative and the paternal subsist in these in a feminine manner. In the second genera of the gods, i.e., the intelligible-intellectual gods, union is derived from the male, but separation from the female divinities. Difference, after all, is the cause of unity proceeding into separation and differentiation. The necessary numbers in the set above, then, are the many that unfold an infinite multitude of intellectual power. Another way to think about this is, number must exist before that which is numbered. It functions then as cause to the procreation into differentiation. Number is shown to be that which truly exists, proliferating the unitary one into a multitude of truly existing realities. But if number is, it is necessary that the many should subsist, and an infinite multitude of beings. Or do you think that number, infinite in multitude, will also participate of essence? By all means, I think so. If, therefore, every number participates of essence, will not each part also of number participate of essence? Certainly. Essence, therefore, will be distributed through all things which are many, and will not desert any being, whether the least or the greatest. For how can essence be absent from any being? In no respect. These numbers, then, are essences or absolute realities. In other words, they are intellectual forms. Proclus tells us, "From this highest place of survey of the intellectual gods, it constitutes the first intellectual numbers themselves, which have the nature of forms, are universal, and preside over the whole of generation and production." To be clear, the forms are intelligible and have their summit or hyparxis in the third intelligible triad. As Proclus puts it, every number indeed is form, but not every form is number. However, it is through number that forms at subsequent realms unfold. The nature of number, therefore, pervades from on high as far as to the last of things, adorning all things and connecting them by appropriate forms. This, then, is the first intelligible-intellectual triad, that of number. We have now reached the point in the unfolding of reality in which manyness is starting to manifest out of the unity of the one. Being analogous to the second triad of the intelligible world means that all of the intelligible-intellectual world can be seen as analogous not only to intelligible wholeness, but also to intelligible power, as power holds the middle rank in a triad. All three triads of the second world are generative and so characterized by power. Intelligible power is the unifying force connecting the one and essence in the intelligible world discussed above. This power is also known as infinity. This is significant in understanding why an infinite multitude marks the extremity of both the intelligible world and the first intelligible-intellectual triad. As discussed above, infinity is in the sense of power, not quantity. Infinite quantity, after all, is hostile to the nature of number, as Proclus states. Proclus explains, if, however, it be requisite to survey the unknown peculiarity of divine numbers, and how the first order of intelligibles and intellectuals, and number which subsists according to this order, is the most ancient of all numbers, in the first place we should consider the infinity mentioned by Parmenides. He explains that this infinity gets its power from the intelligible world. As such, it is incomprehensible to discursive thought. The incomprehensibility, therefore, of this power which is unknown according to a discursive energy is comprehended according to cause in intelligible numbers and multitudes. For there would not be a thing of this kind in the last of numbers, unless the unknown pre-existed in intelligible numbers, and unless the former were ultimate imitations of the exempt incomprehensibility of the latter. Now we'll move on to the second intelligible-intellectual triad, and this one is called whole. Having given us this first intelligible-intellectual triad of number, Parmenides will now move on to the second intelligible-intellectual triad. This collectively is the intelligible-intellectual whole, for it is from number that wholes unfold. This whole must include a manyness of parts. Proclus suggests that this triad can be understood by recognizing that Parmenides places one and many in the summit of the triad, whole and part in the middle, and finite and infinite in the extremity. The first order, therefore, of intelligibles and intellectuals is thus surveyed by Parmenides. But after this, the order which possesses the middle place of intelligibles and intellectuals, and which a little before we called connective, presents itself to the view. Since, however, the connective order is triple, one division of it being intelligible, another intelligible and intellectual, and another intellectual, the first monad indeed subsists according to the one and the many, but the second according to whole and parts, and the third according to the finite and the infinite. And so there you see a little diagram showing this second intelligible intellectual triad with one and many on top, whole and parts in the middle, finite and infinite at the extremity. Parmenides then begins from the summit of this second intelligible intellectual triad. He is going to present it as one and many. This, therefore, compels him to return to his previous discussion of the one and essence. But if it is, I think it must always be necessary, as long as it is, that it should be a certain one, but that it cannot possibly be nothing. It is necessary. The one, therefore, is present with every part of essence, deserting no part, whether small or great, and in whatever manner it may be affected. It is so. Parmenides can now make the case that this one, present with every part of essence, must be distributed into a manyness. Can one being, therefore, be a whole, subsisting in many places at once? Consider this diligently. I do consider it, and I see that it is impossible. It is divided, therefore, since it is not a whole, for it cannot otherwise be present with all the parts of essence than in a divided state. This is no longer the one being of the intelligible realm. Here he is presenting us with the one that unfolds through all the realms of reality. But that which is divisible ought necessarily to be so many as its parts. It ought. We did not, therefore, just now speak truly when we said that essence was distributed into very many parts, since it is not divided into more parts than the one, but into parts equal to those of the one. For neither does being desert the one, nor the one being, but these two always subsist, equalized through all things. It appears to be entirely so. The one, therefore, which is distributed by essence is many and an infinite multitude. So it appears. One being, therefore, is not only many, but it is likewise necessary that the one which is distributed by essence should be many. All of this sets Parmenides up to name whole and part as the middle of this second intelligible-intellectual triad. And indeed, in consequence of the parts being parts of a whole, the one will be defined according to a whole, or are not the parts comprehended by the whole? He is now ready to bring in the extremity of the triad, that which marks it both as infinite and as finite. The notion of being comprehended, mentioned at the end of Parmenides' preceding quote, allows him to introduce the bound. To comprehend something means to bind it. That which is unbound or infinite cannot be comprehended. But that which contains will be a bound. Aristotle agrees, allowing Parmenides to summarize the full triad. One being, therefore, is in a certain respect both one and many, whole and parts, finite and infinite in multitude. Unlike in the first hypothesis, here we are seeing the one co-arranged with many. This co-arrangement generates whole and parts. This then gives rise to the finite and at the same time the infinite. For here, these pairs exist together. The bound allows multitude to be finite, yet, despite being bound, this whole contains infinite parts. Proclus explains that one is prior to whole, and whole is prior to the finite. Everything finite is a whole, but not every whole is finite. For the infinite is a whole, whether it is multitude or magnitude. And every whole indeed is one, but not every one is a whole. And that which is without habitude to multitude is not a whole. The one, therefore, is beyond whole, and whole is beyond the finite. This allows us to see this triad as one at the summit, whole in the middle position, and finite at the extremity. We still need the pair to each of these, namely the many, parts, and the infinite. After the same manner also, infinite parts are said to be the parts of that which is finite, for the infinite of itself has no subsistence, by which also it is evident that the infinite is not in quantity and energy, but in capacity. All parts, however, are not infinite, for according to bound they are characterized by one of the parts. And again, parts indeed are many, but the many are not entirely parts. The many, therefore, are prior to parts, and parts are prior to infinites. Hence, as the many are to the one, so are parts to whole, and so are infinites to the finite. And these three connectedly containing monads give completion to the middle order of intelligibles and intellectuals. After setting up this triad as described by both Parmenides and then by Proclus, we are compelled to ask ourselves what is going on here. I will suggest one possible explanation. This triad is the middle triad of the middle world. As such, it holds a pivotal position. It is the midpoint between the intelligible and the intellectual. Its summit, then, is intelligible and expresses both the oneness of the intelligible and the manyness that proceeds from it prior to parts. In the center, we find the true middle of the three higher worlds. Here we have that which is intellectual, yet also in participation with the intelligible. This center is marked by wholes and parts because it is proceeding into the distinction that is the mark of the intellectual worlds, yet still maintaining the wholeness that is the mark of the intelligible world. In the extremity of this triad is that which has proceeded further into intellect. This extremity is marked by a finite whole that contains infinite parts. And now the third intelligible intellectual triad, and this one is called the perfect. The diagram below is the same one that appeared a few pages earlier at the opening of the discussion about the intelligible intellectual triads. Each of these triads is analogous to its counterpart in the intelligible world above it. We have seen that the first intelligible intellectual triad is number and holds a position analogous to intelligible unity, or the one being. The second intelligible intellectual triad is whole. It flows from and is analogous to the intelligible whole. Parmenides is now ready to introduce the perfect. This is the aspect of the intelligible intellectual world that marks the end of its procession. The intellectual act, then, of each realm of reality is to revert to its cause, thus knowing itself and perfecting its being. In the first hypothesis, Parmenides introduces the idea of beginning, middle, and end, and then uses that to lead into the idea of bound or limit. Here in the second hypothesis, though, he turns it around. He introduces bound to denote the finite aspect of the second intelligible intellectual triad. Being bounded, however, the second hypothesis 1 is finite and so must have extremes. It therefore has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Parmenides transitions from bound to having a beginning, middle, and end in just a few sentences. As it is bounded, therefore, must it not also have extremes? It is necessary. But what, if it be a whole, must it not also have a beginning, middle, and end? Or can there be any whole without these three? And if any one of these be wanting, can it be willing to be any longer a whole? It cannot. The entire intelligible intellectual world, because it is marked by difference, advances the unity of the intelligible world toward manifestation. Proclus tells us, that which has extremes, having become a whole, constitutes the perfect through end or bound. But the perfect, comprehending beginnings, middles, and ends, unfolds figure. and thus the perfective triad proceeds supernally, as far as to the last of things, pervading to all things, and perfecting both whole and partial causes. It is in this way that figure is associated with the third triad of the intelligible-intellectual world. Plato captures this notion in this way. But the middle is equally distant from the extremes, for it could not otherwise be the middle. It could not. And, as it appears, the one being such will participate of a certain figure, whether straight or round, or a certain mixture from both. It will so. It is important to note here that we are still far in our metaphysical journey from the physical realm. It would not make sense to think of beginning, middle, and end in any physical terms, but rather as having progressed as far in differentiation so as to reach a distinct triad, that which can revert on itself and so know itself intellectually as power. This reversion does not have figure, then, in the physical sense. Its only true figure is ousia, the revertive activity of turning on itself and thereby knowing itself. This, as mentioned at the opening of the discussion of the intelligible-intellectual world, is the divine experience of reality referred to in various ways throughout Plato's dialogues. And so, from this demonstration of figure, Parmenides has set the stage to introduce the intellectual triad. The intellectual triad is the home of the forms, the absolute realities from which the psychical and physical realms unfold. Okay, I will stop today's video there. I do hope that you found this explanation helpful in opening up what is going on in the second hypothesis. Again, if you did find it helpful, I would appreciate your feedback in the comment section if there were any sections of this reading where you felt that more explanation or more discussion would have been helpful. If anything was confusing to you, it's really helpful to me to know that. So I would appreciate you putting that in the comment section as well. And I hope that you will join me for the next video where I go through the rest of the second hypothesis. Thank you very much.